There's a very old riddle you've probably heard before. A man's driving down the road with his son. There's an accident. Both father and son are taken to the hospital. The father's injuries are not severe, but the son requires immediate surgery. When the son is wheeled into the operating room, the surgeon takes one look at him and says, "Wait a minute, I can't operate on this boy. He's my son." So the riddle is, who is the surgeon? Of course, the answer is the surgeon is the boy's mother. 40 years ago, that riddle always got people stumped because the assumption for most people was a surgeon is always going to be a man. It blew people's minds either to imagine a woman being a surgeon, or it blew their minds to think, well, hey, I believe in women's equality, and it still didn't dawn on me, or it wasn't my first thought, that the surgeon could be a woman. But today, if you tell that riddle, people are far less likely to be stumped because things have changed. We're less likely to associate the word surgeon with one gender or another. And today, of course, the riddle could have a completely different answer because we have plenty of parents for the exact same gender. Now, even though that riddle doesn't really work anymore, I told it to you anyway, because it's still a wonderful example of how we interpret things and how our interpretations can change. It illustrates that we all carry with us unconsciously a set of biases and assumptions, prejudices, and personal experience that inform what we believe. Over the years, I seem to have more and more people coming to me to talk about their faith because it's become a riddle to them. They feel conflicted or confused. Something's upset the apple cart of their basic beliefs. And they hope that by talking with me, because I'm supposed to be an expert on this stuff, that they'll gain some clarity, some relief, some answers. Everyone who does that is unique, but if there is a common thread, it's that an event has occurred in their life that's caused them to really reevaluate things. Someone they love has died. Someone they cared for has left their life. They've received a scary diagnosis. They've lost a job, or they've just retired. They've been rejected or abused or otherwise hurt. They feel lost. Whatever the issue, somehow life simply is not turning out the way they had envisioned. So they start asking questions they may have never asked before. Now, it could be they never had a reason to ask those questions before, but in a lot of cases, it's because to even ask those questions, they were taught, meant that you were somehow being unfaithful. To ask too many questions or to have doubts meant that God or the church or your family might not love and accept you anymore. So, after listening to their story and getting a sense of what they're struggling with, that's when I usually suggest that we talk about interpretation. Now, there are two scripture passages today I want to focus on, and the first one is from Nehemiah in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. In that story, priests at the temple in Jerusalem had discovered some ancient scrolls. It was amazing. These scrolls had been sealed up behind a stone wall for who knows how long, and they were doing some renovations, discovered, wow, here are these new scrolls. They're actually very, very old. The scrolls contain the 10 Commandments and other laws everyone thought had been long lost. So the priests carefully unrolled them and read them aloud to a huge crowd of people standing all around. So let's listen to what they said. The scripture says, so they read from the book, from the law of God with interpretation. They gave the sense so that the people could understand the reading. Now, my first reaction to this is, hold on, they're reading the 10 Commandments. How do you interpret thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, and so on and so forth? I mean, the 10 Commandments, well, they're about as straightforward as you can get, right? But here they were reading all of that and then telling their audience what it meant, how it was relevant for their own lives, in that particular day and time. My second reaction is, hey, this story's in the Bible. So the Bible is explicitly telling us it is perfectly acceptable and even necessary whenever you read a passage of Scripture, even something that seems pretty obvious and black and white, like the Ten Commandments, to then interpret what it might mean for you. Second passage you may have heard before. Early on in his ministry, Jesus is in his hometown synagogue, and he's been given the privilege of standing up and reading that day's scripture and then saying something about it. In other words, he was their guest preacher that day. How would you like that on your church marquee? Preaching today, Jesus. That'd draw a crowd. And after the service, hey, that guy was pretty good. We ought to invite him back next week. The interesting thing, though, and what we need to pay attention to is this, is that when Jesus was done, they never wanted him to come back ever again. He starts out by reading a passage from Isaiah. God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Then Jesus gets to interpret what he's just read. Now, this is what everyone's been waiting for. And he simply says this, today this passage has been fulfilled in your hearing. In other words, Jesus is saying, I am the one who's going to do all that stuff Isaiah was writing about. That was his interpretation. And it did not go over very well. How dare Jesus stand there and presume to say that God was going to work that way through him? They got so mad at him, they took him to the outskirts of town and wanted to throw him off a cliff, but he got away. So interpretation can definitely get you into trouble. Because everyone, whether they realize it or not, has their own set of assumptions, their own expectations, their own experiences that tell them this is the way things are and this is the way they're supposed to be. Everyone has their own interpretation. Everyone has said, this is how I see things. The people in that synagogue in Nazareth had been reading that passage from Isaiah for years. They were taught it meant one thing and one thing only. And that was the only authentic way to understand it. But then Jesus comes along. Here's how interpretation works. Let's say two women are standing on a street corner waiting at a crosswalk when suddenly two cars collide at that intersection. One car is going straight through the intersection while another car is coming in the opposite direction through that intersection but making a turn, so the cars crash. Now it's just a fender bender, no one's hurt, no one's going to the hospital to have their mother operate on them. But who is to blame? The two women standing on the corner saw the whole thing unfold right before them. They witnessed the same accident. When the police officer shows up to interview these two eyewitnesses, will they both have the same interpretation of what caused the wreck? Maybe. But unless these eyewitnesses are exact clones of each other with the exact same set of life experiences and personal likes and dislikes and attitudes and prejudices, their interpretation of which driver caused this wreck are very likely to be different. Maybe one driver is a teenager, while the other is a middle-aged person. Now, if one of the two women who witnessed the accident is a teenager and the other is a middle-aged person, will that make a difference in how they feel about who is at fault? What if one car is a brand spanking new Mercedes and the other car is a rusty old beat-up Chevy? If one witness is affluent and the other is poor, will that make a difference? What if one of the drivers is a close personal friend of one of the witnesses, best buds, and that same driver, though, used to be the boss of the other witness, and that witness was fired unjustly, she believes, by that driver, and right before Christmas? Guilty. So, Interpretation is made up of the baggage we all carry around with us that tells us what's likely to be true or not, what's right or not. Even things we believe are hard facts, black and white obvious things, are open to interpretation. So we have two examples from the Bible itself, and there are a whole lot more, telling us in big bold letters that there are different ways to interpret the Bible. And if there are different ways to interpret the Bible, that means there are different ways to think about God. The Bible gives us permission and even encourages us to ask those questions, to question our assumptions, to examine our beliefs, and know that it's perfectly all right to arrive at new conclusions. That is the value of interpretation. But one of the biggest lies that's ever been sold to us is that there's only one correct way to think about our relationship to God, and even who God is and how God works in our lives and in the world. Because that lie is exactly what compels someone who's struggling with their faith to come visit me seeking answers to a riddle they can't solve. It's not that something bad's happened in their life or they're going through a major change. That kind of thing happens to all of us. The problem is they cannot make heads or tails of that issue because they've been taught their whole life that there's only one way to think about their faith. There's only one way to believe, and that way just doesn't work for them anymore. It can't work for them anymore because if you've ever lost a child or a spouse or a partner or someone you love so much that you would gladly give your own life to save theirs, and if you've been told by well-meaning friends or someone like me that we can't understand these things, but it must have been God's will, or that God has called them home, or that God must have needed another angel in heaven, then I can't blame you for not having faith in God anymore. Or at the very least wondering, why? If God is a loving God, this kind of thing can possibly happen. If you've ever been told it's best not to question these things, that's just the mysterious way God works, please know this: it is perfectly okay to question those things. It is perfectly fine to wrestle with the stuff we've always believed to be true when that truth no longer makes any sense. It's perfectly okay to doubt. We've made the mistake of thinking that God's love and acceptance and presence and promises somehow depend on us and what we believe. No. God's love and acceptance and presence and promises, they don't depend on us. They don't depend on our interpretation of who God is. God's love comes with no conditions. And God is far bigger than anyone's interpretation. God is love, is love, is love, is love. It says so right in the Bible. And that's my interpretation. Thanks so much for watching.